everyone, Dannaca here, and as promised, I'm answering all of your surrogacy related questions from the previous surrogacy video. Now, I took all of your questions, and in doing so, I created an outline pretty much from start to finish of, from how you apply to become a surrogate all the way down to childbirth and beyond. In creating this outline, I ended up with about 4 pages of information, so I'm going to try my best not to make this video too long, but I can't promise you that it won't be. I've created this video in 5 different stages, so if you go into the description box and you want to click ahead to a particular stage, there's a link right next to that stage and you can go ahead and skip ahead. The first stage I'm going to talk about is how to become a surrogate candidate. That's going to have everything to do with, with the application process, filling out your profile, sending in particular pictures, things like that. Stage 2 I'm calling the legal stuff, and that has to do with all of the legal ramifications of becoming a surrogate, contracts, paternity, your rights and responsibilities, all that stuff. Stage 3 I'm calling let's get pregnant. Basically, it's about how a surrogate goes about getting pregnant, the cycles, whether or not the intended parents are going to use a donor, things like that. Also talking about all of the medications that are used, well, all of the medications that I use. And I'll also give a couple of demonstrations on how I administered medication to myself during my process as a surrogate. Stage 4 I'm going to call We're Pregnant, and that stage is going to basically cover the moment I received the positive pregnancy test all the way down to getting ready to give birth. And stage 5 I've titled Let's Have a Baby. This is basically going to cover the birth plan, after birth, discussing, attachment issues, whether or not I'd want to be a surrogate again, and a little bit about the intended parent that I was a surrogate for. At the end of this video, I'll pretty much just sum up the entire process just to give you a little bit of an understanding by reiterating some of the things that we talked about that you might be confused about. And that'll be the end of the video. So sit tight and enjoy the ride. Stage 1, becoming a surrogate candidate. Okay, so this is basically the part where I'm going to talk about how you go about even attempting to become a surrogate mother. Now, throughout this entire process, I'm going to tell you what I did. By no means should you take this as the gospel of surrogate parenting. I just want to lay that disclaimer out there. This was my experience, and not all surrogacy experiences are the same. There are many different surrogate agencies, fertility organizations, and independent forms of surrogacy as well. So like I said, please don't, take everything that I'm saying with a grain of salt, because my process could be completely opposite and different from somebody else's experience or process. Now, when I became a surrogate candidate for this particular surrogacy agency, basically what I did was I went online and I filled out an application. Now, you can find a surrogacy agency by simply Googling. So many surrogacy agencies will pop up when you just Google, I want to be a surrogate mother, or becoming a surrogate mother, or any of those things. I mean, you can even go on Craigslist and search surrogacy or surrogate motherhood, and you'll find loads of agencies that are looking for surrogate mothers, because there are so many intended parents out there that are unable to have kids on their own, whether they be single parents, or there's single intended parents, or married intended parents, gay intended parents. And I mean, when I say gay, I mean 2 males, not 2 females, because very, very few, and I've never even heard of any, very few homosexual couples that go to surrogacy agencies that are 2 females get turned away because one female happens to be infertile and is the one that's willing to carry the baby, but the other female is fertile, but she doesn't want to carry a baby. And the surrogacy agency will turn that couple away because they feel that if there's at least one person in the relationship that is capable of becoming pregnant and carrying that pregnancy to term, they're not considered an infertile couple. They will be referred to a fertility clinic where they can go about the process of maybe finding a sperm donor or something like that. But if there is at least one female in in the marriage or, you know, in the partnership that is capable of carrying a baby to term, then they will be required to take that responsibility. You'd be surprised at how many women that want babies don't want to carry them. And that's not just, you know, homosexual couples. That's even women that are in heterosexual marriages and they just don't want to ruin their bodies. They don't want to be pregnant because they're afraid. And all the surrogacy agencies that I know of, some fertility organizations, will turn those women away, will turn those couples away, because there are too many women, there are too many couples that are incapable of having babies, and accommodating, you know, a couple that is very capable of doing that, it kind of messes with their ethics clause or something. I don't know, but that's just FYI. So when you complete the application, basically what you're giving to them on this application is obviously all of your demographic information, your employment history, and things of that nature. The most important thing that you're going to give to the surrogacy agency is your pregnancy history. Have you had any infertility issues? Have you had any miscarriages, any abortions? How many live births have you had? How many pregnancies have you had? All of that information. I'll get more into that in a little bit. Something that surrogate agencies also want to know is if you are on any government assistance. If you're on any government assistance like welfare or food stamps, cash aid, things of that nature, you're going to be denied. Well, your application is going to be denied for surrogacy. They don't want people who are on government assistance being surrogate moms for whatever reason. It could be that they don't just want people becoming surrogate moms for the money. And then there are some other legal ramifications with regard to being on government assistance, because the compensation for surrogacy is going to affect your income that, you know, that comes from the government every month. And so they don't want to interfere with that, and they don't want to get involved in that whole process. It's kind of a weird process. So if you are on government assistance, you're on welfare, you get food stamps or anything like that, your application for surrogacy will be denied. Some of the things that you will be asked on the application or questionnaire that you fill out is why you want to become a surrogate. What is your family like? What is your living situation? Things of that nature. They're also going to ask you if you have a preference for a compensation amount and whether or not it's negotiable. There are so many different types of compensation in surrogacy. There's monetary compensation. There's altruistic surrogacy, which I think is awesome if you're able to do it. Altruistic surrogacy is when you're a surrogate and nothing is paid for by the intended parent. You pretty much take on all the costs of being a surrogate and they don't pay you anything. There are many monetary benefits, not just compensation, but benefits where the IPs cover all of your medical expenses, all your traveling. They pay for all of your food and things of that nature. So they will ask you on the questionnaire if you request any of those things. Then they're just gonna ask you, you know, what are your interests? What's your personality type? Who do you want to work with? Who are you willing to work with? Are you willing to work with only married couples? Are you willing to work with single intended parents? Are you willing to work with homosexual parents? Are you willing to work with unmarried couples? Do you have any religious preferences where if you're Christian, you would prefer to work with other Christian couples or individuals? If you're Jewish, would you only like to work for Jewish individuals or couples? And then some agencies are going to ask you, are you interested in artificial insemination, AI surrogacy, or just gestational surrogacy, where the embryo is not genetically connected to you? Artificial insemination surrogacy is when the egg is provided by the surrogate and the sperm is injected into the uterus, and then it's like that whole natural way of fertilizing an egg. And then gestational surrogacy is when you go through the process of in vitro fertilization, better known as IVF, and there is an egg used by either the intended mother who cannot carry her baby to term, or the couple or single intended parent will acquire an egg donor, where an egg donor will donate a bunch of eggs. All of the eggs will be fertilized with the intended father's sperm, or if he has an issue, maybe donor sperm, and the embryos, the fertilized embryos, will be implanted or transferred into the gestational surrogate's uterus. After the application process, you will be contacted by the surrogacy agency to let you know whether or not you've been accepted into the program. Well, they usually schedule like a phone call, like a phone interview if you're not local, and basically they'll take all the information from your application and then interview you over the phone, pretty much repeating all of the questions that you answered on the survey or questionnaire or the application that you filled out, but a little bit more in depth. So they'll probably dig a little bit deeper if they don't understand some of the answers that you gave, because many of the questions that are on the application are open-ended. They're not just like yes or no questions, and so they might want you to explain a little bit further. After your telephone interview, there is a matching process, and basically you are put in a database of surrogate moms, and intended parents will search through this database and they will look for somebody who probably more likely matches their personality or someone they think that they would get along with. A lot of things that they look at is like your education history, your employment history. Are you interested in the same things? Do you read the same books? Do you watch the same types of movies? Things like that. And so when they search through that surrogacy database and they pick you, the surrogacy agency will give you a call and say, or they'll email you and they'll say, hey, we've got intended parents or an intended parent that is super interested in you, and they're wondering if you would like to look at their profile, and after you look at their profile, you know, if you'd like to meet. So basically, you know, if you're still open to being a surrogate, which this usually doesn't take very long because surrogacy agencies are looking for surrogate moms all the time, and there are couples and individuals waiting, like as we speak right now, for a surrogate mom. And so usually it's like within about a week or so that you complete the application process and you complete your interview, that you'll be getting phone calls or emails from the surrogacy agency letting you know that there are couples in waiting and wondering if you would join them in the surrogacy journey. So once you read the intended parent's profile, pretty much it's in the same format as your profile was. They submit pictures of themselves. I forgot to mention that. You guys do submit pictures with your application as well. Pictures of yourself, pictures of your family, people that you live with, pictures of things that you love doing, your hobbies and interests and things like that. So that'll be some of the same things that you'll be looking at when you're looking at the intended parent's profile. If you think that the intended parent or parents have a lot in common with you, or that you'd really like to work with them, then you let the agency know, and then they'll set up a sort of like a meetup with you and just you, not your family quite yet, but just you and a representative from the surrogacy agency to meet with the intended parents. Once you've met and you start going over some of the legal questions that you might have about surrogacy, or any questions that you might have for the intended parents, what their expectations are, and vice versa, what their expectations are of you and your expectations of them, then you go home and you give it about 24 hours. You think about all the things that you've talked about, and within about 24 to 48 hours you get back to the surrogacy agency and you let them know whether or not you're willing to move forward with these particular people or this particular person, the intended parents. They have the same amount of time to get back to the agency, and if you're both a match, if you both say, yes, I'd love to work with that intended parent or those intended parents, and he or she or them, they come back and they say, yes, we'd love to work with that surrogate mom or that potential surrogate mom, then that's when all the fun begins. In my particular situation, my intended parent, he was super eager to get started. So a lot of my process in the very beginning was very, very quick. Like, I had to hit the ground running, and I'll explain that at the end of the video when I sum everything up. Right now I just want to kind of give you the generalized process of what I went through and kind of speak generally. You'll probably notice that I'm speaking in second person, talking as if you were to become a surrogate mom. I'm not really talking in first person saying I or this or that. I'm really trying to speak in like second person, as if I'm speaking to you and what your experience would be, by basically generalizing my experience. Like I said in the beginning, my experience isn't going to be the same as everybody else's, but just to kind of get you to make this kind of a more interactive video, I'm trying to make it as though you're going through the process. So once the intended parents and the surrogate mom agree that they want to work together, and you both contact the agency and say, yes, we want to work together, that is when the intended parents are to deposit or to open a trust fund in the amount of 6 figures. Yes, 6 figures. Now that could be anywhere between $100,000 to whatever, to beyond. Sometimes it can go up to 7 figures, but the intended parent must deposit at least 6 figures into a trust account. This money is going to cover all of your evaluations, your medical evaluation, your psychological evaluation, your background check, all attorney's fees. So their attorney's fees and including your attorney's fees for when the contract negotiation process begins. It's gonna cover all of your lost wages, your mileage between work and your appointments or home and your appointments, your spouse or significant other's lost wages in case they need to drive you someplace because you need to have a procedure. Say you have a miscarriage and you need a DNC, it's gonna cover that. It's gonna cover your miscarriage fees. It's gonna cover your amniocentesis if you need one when you're pregnant. It's gonna cover all of your office visits if you have co-pays. It's gonna cover all of those uncommon ultrasounds, like, you know, extra gender ultrasounds that the intended parents might want to get in case they're not in town when you go through the anatomical ultrasound that you typically have around 18 to 20 weeks, I think. It's going to cover your surrogate fee, your compensation, all of your benefits of being a surrogate. It's going to include your twin or triplet fee. You're going to be compensated if you carry multiples, if you're carrying twins or triplets. It's going to cover all of your maternity clothing. It's going to cover any of your special diet needs. If the intended parent requests that you have a special diet, they're going to be required to provide the food for you. You're not going to have to come out of pocket for any special organic, you know, foods that they would prefer you eat. And so after, you know, this money is put away in the trust fund, this is when the process really starts rolling. The first thing that the agency is going to ask you to do, so first the intended parents have to, you know, set up a trust fund. What they're going to ask you to do as a surrogate mother is to provide all of your medical records for your previous pregnancies. Now that's something that's a requirement. The medical records and the fact that you've been pregnant before, you have had at least one live birth, you have at least one living child, or at least you gave birth to a living child. It doesn't really matter if the child passed away afterward, as long as you gave birth to a living child, that's going to be a requirement in order to become a surrogate mom. So basically what the fertility doctor that you're going to be seeing, that's going to be evaluating you medically, what he or she is going to want to see is the medical records for when you were pregnant, so they can see if you had any complications throughout your pregnancy or pregnancies. They're also going to want to see any operations. If you had any C-sections, they're going to want to see that the report, the operations or operative report, or whatever they call it, the report that the doctor submits if he or she does perform a C-section. They're going to want to see that. They're going to want to see the report from the birth, if it was a vaginal delivery, if it was a C-section, if it was a VBAC, which is a vaginal birth after C-section. They're going to want to see what medications you were on during your pregnancy, what medications were used during childbirth. All of these things are necessary so that the fertility doctor knows, you know, what your body is capable of, if you're going to be capable to carry a baby to term via IVF or AI, what you're a better candidate for, whether you're a better candidate for AI or IVF. This is all going to be considered when you are being medically evaluated. You're also going to be required to go through a background check. Now this background check can cover a lot of different things. A lot of different surrogacy agencies look at credit checks. Sometimes they all look at criminal background to see if you're a convicted felon or things like that. If you are, you're going to be denied. But basically what they're looking for is if you have any felonies, any drug offenses, or any like judgments against you. Like, have you been taken to small claims? Have you been sued in civil court? Any number of those things they're looking for. They want to see if you've had any bankruptcies. They want to know if you've ever been evicted from, an apartment, things like that. They're looking at your background to make sure that you're a responsible individual, that you're not in like this major debt up to your ears, and that's why you're becoming a surrogate, so you can kind of like pay off those debts. They really want to make sure that you're becoming a surrogate for the right reasons. After your criminal background check, you're going to also have a psychological evaluation where a psychologist is going to either make you take like a test online to evaluate whether or not they think you're depressed or anxious or crazy, mental health issues, any of those things. After you take the little quiz or questionnaire online that they have you do, which is kind of extensive, it takes a little while to finish, they set up an interview where they will go over all of those questions and answers of the questionnaire. And they'll ask you a little bit about your family background, if you had any mental health care issues, if you've ever been admitted to a mental institution, things of that nature. And so after you have that conversation with the psychologist, then they write a clearance letter and let the surrogacy agency know whether or not you have passed the psychological evaluation. Last but not least, you'll have your medical evaluation. And this is after the criminal background check and your psychological evaluation comes back clean and clear. The reason they wait on that is because the medical evaluation is the most expensive evaluation in becoming a surrogate. There are a whole host of lab tests that need to be done. Some agencies require, or some fertility organizations require, that you go through genetic testing to make sure that you don't have any genetic disorders. They also do a hysterosonogram. And just a quick description of what the hysterosonogram is basically where the fertility doctor will inject saline through the cervix into the uterus to kind of open it up a little bit so they can get a better picture of what your uterus and your endometrial lining looks like, to make sure it's healthy, you don't have any polyps or things like that. If you want to learn a little bit more about what a hysterosonogram is, I'll kind of like put it in a little annotation right here, and go ahead and click that right there, and you can view like a 3-minute video on what a hysterosonogram actually is. So after the doctor does the hysterosonogram and he sees that everything is fine, and he gives you orders to go get your blood drawn, for all your lab tests and genetic testing, you sit with the doctor and he or she interviews you, and they go over all the medical records that you have submitted to them. If they have any questions about what went on during a particular pregnancy, you would answer it then during that office visit, and he would go ahead and evaluate all of your medical records and talk to you about some concerns that he or she may have, and that's pretty much it. Stage 2, the legal stuff. So once you've been medically and psychologically cleared to become a surrogate, you will be assigned an attorney to represent you throughout the rest of the process of being a surrogate mother. This attorney is picked out for you, but if you have your own attorney, you can go ahead and let the intended parents know that you have your own attorney. The agency prefers that you use an attorney that is well-versed and experienced in surrogate motherhood and in vitro fertilization. Basically, an attorney that is experienced in reproductive endocrinology, reproductive technology, all of those things. And so they prefer to pick the attorney for you. But if you want to use your own attorney, that's perfectly fine. That'll have to be something that's stated in the contracts and things of that nature. But if you go ahead and hire the attorney that the agency provides for you, the intended parents will pay all of the attorney's fees. At this point, the intended parent's attorney will initiate contact with your attorney and put together a contract, a surrogacy contract, a gestational surrogacy contract if you are a gestational surrogate. And once they send that contract over to your attorney is going to contact you either over the phone, or if you're both local, then you would meet with the attorney in his or her office and you would go over the contract together. I went over the contract with my attorney over the phone because I'm in Orange County and she is all the way, I think she was like in Sherman Oaks or something like that, which is pretty far if you're trying to travel there on a weekday. So I was good with speaking on the phone with her. She emailed me the contract and we went section by section. Now basically the common things that you're going to come across in this contract are things that state, okay, who the parents are, who the surrogate is, what your rights and responsibilities are, the fact that you will have no parental rights over the child that you're carrying and giving birth to, that you're not going to put the baby at risk during the pregnancy or after, that you promise to, take care of yourself, maintain a healthy lifestyle, and that you understand that either an egg donor will be used or the intended mother's egg will be used, coupled with either a sperm donor or the intended father's sperm. Sometimes the contracts will mention that you will try to become pregnant so many times, or you will attempt so many cycles just to make sure that the intended parent is not kind of signing a contract with a surrogate that doesn't plan on trying more than one time. Because after putting so much money into all the evaluations, the legal fees, and all of this, all the appointments, and the fertility organization fees and things like that, they want to make sure that you are in it for at least 3 or 4 cycles, because they're putting a lot of money into it. And if it fails the first time and you kind of just want to give up, that means they've wasted so much money, and then they have to find another surrogate and spend all of that same money all over again. And it becomes super costly, and they don't want to get involved in that. So in my contract, it stated that I would try at least 3 times, or I would have at least 3 cycles to attempt to become pregnant. The contract will also talk about whether or not you would be willing to breastfeed or pump after you've given birth to the baby, if you would be willing to provide breast milk for the baby. And it'll also include some restrictions, like traveling restrictions. I wasn't allowed to travel more than 100 miles away from the hospital I was going to deliver at. After a certain point in the pregnancy, I believe it was like 32 or 33 weeks gestation, I wasn't allowed to travel very far. I wasn't allowed to get on any planes. There were certain eating restrictions that I had. There were certain sexual restrictions, like I couldn't have sex during a cycle while I was trying to become pregnant, to make sure that the baby that I did become pregnant with wasn't mine or my significant other's. And then there are other activities that can or may be restricted. Now, if at any point in your contract you disagree with some of these restrictions, you are actually encouraged to let your attorney know that you don't agree with certain parts of the contract, and your attorney will go back to your intended parent's attorney and say, you know what, my surrogate is not comfortable with these restrictions. Can we compromise? Can we change this? Can we remove this entire paragraph? And the attorneys will go ahead and talk that over. At no point in time are you supposed to talk to the intended parent's attorney or the intended parents about the contract. Anything regarding the legal contract is only supposed to be talked about between the 2 attorneys' offices. There are also things in the contract, such as, what if, during the process, the intended parent decides they don't want the baby or babies anymore? What happens if the intended parents die? What happens if they get into this major car wreck, or something happens to the intended parents and you're pregnant, and what happens to the baby afterwards? That's all in the contract. All of it should be in the contract. If it's not, make sure you get it put in the contract. But they usually have backup persons to take care of the baby, and they even put in, well, what if something happens to all of the backup persons? I mean, you can negotiate all the way down to, if there is nobody to come and take this baby that it was intended to be for, then you could even have it written into your contract that you would adopt the baby, or you would give the baby up for adoption to somebody that you would agree that the baby should go to. Not the agency wouldn't decide who the baby goes to. The attorneys wouldn't decide who the baby goes to. You can decide who the baby goes to. And that's only if something devastating happens to the intended parents and their backup persons. There are also things in the contract that talk about your requirements for medical insurance. Now, you're not required to have medical insurance if you become a surrogate, because most agencies will require that the intended parents provide medical insurance for you if you don't have any. But it's always best, and you're always more of an awesome candidate that people want to work with if you have your own medical insurance, because that's a cost that intended parents don't want to take on. And so, I have my own medical insurance through my employment, and so they loved that. So the only thing they had to pay for was like co-pays and, particular procedures that weren't covered by my insurance. There's also going to be a life insurance policy put in place for you. If anything happens to you during the surrogacy that was a result of the surrogacy, they will have a life insurance policy for you. I believe that the life insurance policies start off at about $250,000, and they can be more than that if you request more than that, particularly if you have a family that needs to be taken care of. If something happens to you, depending on how many kids you have, or maybe you have a spouse house or, you know, anything else that needs to be taken care of. That's all negotiated in the contract as well. I think one of the most important things that they put in the contract is termination of pregnancy. There are so many different things that can happen in IVF pregnancies, even AI pregnancies, things that can go wrong. There are some genetic issues that may or may not happen. There might be Down syndrome. Any of those things could happen when you become a surrogate. And that is one of the most important things that you want to make sure is put into the contract, whether or not you're willing to terminate if some of these things arise, like Down syndrome, or maybe you're pregnant with multiples and the intended parent didn't want you to be pregnant with multiples and they want to reduce the pregnancy, meaning basically aborting one or more of the babies, because multiple pregnancies are high-risk pregnancies, and a lot of intended parents don't want to risk the surrogate going through a multiple pregnancy, because if something happens to one, something could potentially, you know, it can endanger the second one or the third one. And so termination and reduction is mentioned in the contract, and that is something that you need to go over thoroughly. You also need to go over, you know, if anything happens to the babies or if anything happens to you, there might be a clause in there or a paragraph in there about keeping you on life support so that the baby can continue to grow. And then after the baby, you know, is ready to be born, you know, via C-section, you know, they can take you off of life support and all of these different things. And so it's a lot, you guys. I know it's a lot. This video is probably going to be an hour long, but it's a lot, you guys. And if you really want to become a surrogate, or if you know anybody that wants to become a surrogate, they have to take some of these things into consideration. These are things that also that are going to be discussed in your psychological evaluation. They're going to want to know if you are prepared to take something like that on, if you are prepared to terminate a pregnancy if need be, if there's no heartbeat and your body is not miscarrying on its own. You may have to do a DNC, you may have to, you know, have surgery, you may have to you may lose a fallopian tube, you may lose an ovary because of, you know, the medications or the procedures that you go through. You could lose your entire uterus, you guys. Being a surrogate is a huge risk, and there is a lot of loss involved in these risks. Yes, you will be compensated if these things take place, but this is all in the contract. And so if you are compensated, if certain things arise, you can't go back and sue the fertility organization or sue the intended parent or sue the surrogacy agency for any more compensation, because you have signed basically the contract that states this is all the compensation you're going to get if something like this happens to you. And so you have to really discuss with your attorney whether or not this is something that you're really willing to do. And if it's not, you can either compromise on the contract, or if you can't come to a compromise, then you'll probably sever your relationship with those intended parents or that intended parent, and you'll have to start all over again, and so will they. Thankfully, you're not going to be responsible for any of the psychological, medical, or background check, any of those evaluations monetarily, because you went into the agreement knowing that the intended parents would take care of that, and you are protected when you go through an agency if you go through that entire process, and if the two parties cannot come to an agreement with regard to the contract. So you are protected there. And you know what, in saying that, I want to let you guys know that for all of the surrogates that are watching this video that have gone independent and that didn't use an agency, I commend you, because there are so many legal ramifications that I would not want to deal with on my own, that I would need protection of an agency for. And for all of you guys that went independent or are seeking to be an independent surrogate, you really got to have some tough skin. You really got to be able to represent yourself. I mean, even when it comes to, you know, your attorney not really doing the things that you want them to do, you really have to know the surrogacy process and know what you want going into the surrogacy process before you actually do it, because I'm telling you, any and everything can happen during this process to where the intended parents will try to sue you 3 or 4 years after, you know, something devastating happens, like a miscarriage or a loss of twins, you know, at 23 weeks we won't go there right now. But if you are looking to be an independent surrogate, or if you have been an independent surrogate, I commend you because I could not be a surrogate without the protection of the agency and an attorney at the same time. Also in the contract is your compensation and benefits package. So in negotiating your compensation or your benefits, you are going to not only negotiate that, but you're going to provide your paycheck stubs for your lost wages. And by lost wages, I mean, you know, because you had to, you know, go to work late, or you had to miss work altogether because of a medical procedure related to the surrogacy, or you had a doctor's appointment, you had a fertility appointment, any hospitalizations that are a result of the surrogacy. All of that is going to be part of your compensation and benefits package. And so that pretty much sums up, you know, most of what's in the contract. There are so many other things that could go along in this contract that, you know, the intended parents can request, or even you can request with regard, you know, diet restrictions. I mentioned these before. Now, I hope I answered all of the legal questions. If I didn't, go ahead and put them in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you in the comments. Stage 3, let's get pregnant. Okay, so after you've signed your contract, and your intended parents have signed the contract, and you filed the contract with the agency and with your insurance company, with the courts and all this other stuff, then the real fun begins. So after contracts are signed, you and the intended parent get together, but this time you also bring your families. And so with my family, you know, I brought my kids and the intended parent. If they want to bring any more family that's going to be involved in the surrogacy process, this is when you guys get together and you get to know each other, and you kind of create a bond prior to the cycles or the surrogacy actually starting. Now, during this process, in the background, if the intended parents need an egg donor, the egg donor is going to be getting ready to start a cycle and get the process going for retrieval of eggs. But basically, you coordinate a meeting over the phone so that you can all meet. And after you've met, then the cycles start. So the donor gets on her cycle and the surrogate starts the cycle, and their cycles are pretty much timed together. And how they did that in my particular situation was they put me on birth control pills. I'll go over all of the medications that they put me, well, not all of them, but most of them, most of the important ones, to let you know all the medications that I was on and things of that nature. So basically the donor is put on a cycle to get her ready for retrieval. She'll take injection, you know, hormones to grow eggs in her ovaries. And once the retrieval time comes where the follicles are mature enough for them to go in and retrieve those eggs via syringe or however they do it, it's a really like long needle they do through ultrasound and all that other stuff. I'll do a video on egg donor stuff at a different time because I was an egg donor, so I can kind of give you that experience as well. But for now, I will not get into that one too much. Okay, so they retrieve the donor's eggs. While they are in the process of doing that, I'm also put on a cycle to where, you know, my hormones are suppressed and more of these synthetic hormones are kind of taking over in my body. I was given a calendar at the very beginning of the cycle. This is the cycle, this is the third cycle that I did where a pregnancy was actually achieved. And so this cycle was done in December of 2014 through January of 2015. The calendar tells me when I'm supposed to take certain medications. On December 24th, that was when I took my last birth control pill, and I started Lupron that day. Let me go over all the medications that I was taking during this cycle. I was taking a lot of stuff. So there was the estrase or estradiol that I was taking. There was the progesterone injections that I was taking. There were the Lupron injections I was taking. And all of these things were vital in, you know, helping with the IVF process. And I will go ahead and show you how I did the injections for the Lupron and the progesterone.
Okay, so for the Lupron injection, I use the standard half-inch needles typically used for insulin injections. You can kind of see the size comparison of the syringe to my hand. The dosage I would administer each day was anywhere from 5 to 10 cc's or units. So every day I would just pop the top off like so. Let me first show you the size of the needle. This particular needle is 28 gauges. The larger the number, the smaller the needle. Keep that in mind for the following injection. I'll flick it with my fingernail a few times to get rid of the bubbles, and now let's find a spot to inject. I still have my linea nigra. It'll hang around another 18 months. So Lupron is a subcutaneous injection. It is administered in the abdomen, below the belly button, on either side. I usually stay pretty close to the center though, so that's what I'll do today. I've already washed my hands, so all I need now is an alcohol pad. I'm super ashy, sorry. Anyway, I clean the desired injection site with the alcohol pad. Then I fan the area to dry the alcohol. This helps the injection not to burn when it breaks through the skin. Take the needle at about a 90-degree angle and inject. I never use the dart method because I have always been afraid of stabbing myself with needles, so I gently press it against my skin until it slides in easily. It helps if the sharpest part of the needle is pointing 90 degrees entering the skin. The progesterone injection, better known as progesterone in oil or PIO, is a much larger injection. The syringe you see here is attached to a 22-gauge 1.5-inch needle used only for drawing up the progesterone. Because it is in oil, it is very difficult to draw from the vial into the syringe. Once we do get it into the syringe though, we can change it to a 25-gauge 1.5-inch needle for a less frightening, more comfortable injection. I simply screw the 22-gauge off of the syringe, open a new 25-gauge needle, and screw it on the syringe. As you can see, it's screwed on nice and snug. But let me show you the gauge of this needle so that you can compare the two sizes. I allowed a little bit more air to get into this syringe because I disconnected the needle, so it'll take a little more than a few flicks to get rid of the bubbles. Just a slight push on the plunger will fix that. The progesterone in oil is an intramuscular injection, so I had to administer the injection into my upper buttock. The easiest way for me to find the perfect spot every time was to just rest my hand on my hip a couple of times, and wherever my thumb landed was the general area I would inject in. Oftentimes I would lose my spot, so I just grab a Sharpie and mark my place. This helps sometimes because it doesn't wash off in the shower very easily, and it helps to remind me which side I injected last. I'll take another alcohol pad and clean the area before the injection. Now I'm supposed to pull the skin around the injection site kinda tight, but because I only have two hands, all I could do was pull my fat out of the way so I could see. Again, no darting motions. I simply push the needle in slowly. You'll see that I'm pulling out a little on the plunger. This is to make sure that no blood enters the syringe. If it does, that means I have most likely hit a blood vessel and should attempt to inject elsewhere. The progesterone isn't usually this easy to push in. It is very thick and sometimes takes me a good 15 to 20 seconds to inject all of it. Oops, got a little bit of blood. Most likely because I was moving the needle around too much. Easy fix. I'll just grab my alcohol wipe. And there you have it.
So I did those injections for about 4 weeks prior to having the transfer, prior to having the embryo put into my uterus. So 4 weeks before, and then up to, I think I was injecting 10 weeks after I found out I was pregnant. So I was injecting progesterone for 10 weeks every single day for 10 weeks straight. And let me tell you, it was terrible. I hated it. I hated injecting myself. I hated the nasty knots I was getting, above my buttocks. It was red and it was bruising. It was horrible. It was a nightmare. I would say that injecting myself every single day was the worst part of the entire process. So let me go ahead and tell you what happens during the transfer. So once, you know, my lining is beautifully formed because of the progesterone and the estrace or estradiol that I was using. Well, the estrace and the estradiol kind of builds up the lining, and then the progesterone softens it up for implantation. When all 3 walls of my uterine lining were ready to go, plump and soft, it was time for the transfer. So I went in, I took my Valium, and I was nice and relaxed. I took my antibiotics and all that stuff to make sure I didn't get any infections. And I went in, and basically the fertility doctor puts a catheter through my cervix and he injects the embryos into my uterus. He injected 2 embryos with hopes that I would become pregnant with twins again, but I did not become pregnant with twins. At first, they thought I might be pregnant with twins. There was like a second sac forming. There was no fetus inside the little second sac, so that second sac disappeared. So I ended up only being pregnant with 1 baby. I had my pregnancy test, I think 10 days, maybe 14 days after my transfer to see if I was pregnant, and I definitely was pregnant. I was so excited. I got the call from the nurse. Well, I took the pregnancy blood test that morning, and the nurse called me in the afternoon and let me know whether or not I was pregnant, and I was. We were all excited. We were elated. Stage 4, we're pregnant. So this is the part where I'm going to talk about, you know, whether or not the baby is biologically mine. No, the baby is not biologically mine at all. There was an egg donor and there was, you know, the intended father. His sperm was used. Now, at no time during the pregnancy did our blood cross. And I mean between the baby and I. My blood and the baby's blood never cross in, you know, throughout the entire pregnancy. The placenta is actually a barrier against that. Like, it's a barrier to protect me, and it's a barrier to protect the baby. The baby's DNA genetic makeup is all of, you know, the egg donor and his father, the intended parent. And so there's none of my DNA in the baby whatsoever. The placenta only allows certain things to come through to the baby. So it plays as a barrier to keep our DNA separate, but at the same time, it's kind of a passageway for, well, it is a passageway for nutrients and things like that for me to go to the baby, and then the baby would dispel waste out into, like, my body, you know. What analogy can I think of to compare to the placenta? I know, okay, so think of the placenta as a window screen, like the window screen on your house. So rain and pollen can come in from outside through the window screen. So think of like the rain and the pollen as, you know, the baby's waste, okay? Rain and pollen can come in through the window screen, but let's say bugs like flies or like spiders, things like that, they can't fit through the little bitty holes of the window screen. And think of that as the baby's DNA, right? Or the baby's blood. So it can't get through that screen. And then on the other hand, the inside of the house, think of that as the surrogate mom's body. And think of it as you know, like the smell of your cooking from inside the house. The smell of your cooking can waft through the holes of the screen to outside. Think of the smell of your cooking as the nutrients that's going into the baby. So the smell of your cooking is the nutrients, but you can't throw your food through the screen of the window. Does that make sense? Like, the food is too big, it can't get through that screen to outside. So think of that as, you know, the surrogate mom's blood or DNA. And so nutrients can get through the smell of the cooking, but the food cannot, which is what carries the smell, you know, the blood, the DNA. And of course, there are always going to be exceptions to the rule. Maybe there might be a little hole in your screen and a fly is able to come through and fly around your house. But it's not really enough to affect the atmosphere of the house. It might be an annoyance, you know, of one or two flies in your house flying around, but it really doesn't it doesn't really rock the foundation of the house or the inside of the house. And that's the same as any of the DNA or the blood from the baby getting into the mom's body, or vice versa. Any of the DNA of the surrogate mom, or the blood of the surrogate mom going into the baby. This happens very rarely. I think the term is feto-maternal chimerism or chimerism or something like that. I'll put the name of it somewhere around here, but it happens very rarely, and when it does happen, it's not so terrible that it affects the carrier of the baby, that they become sick or any of that, and vice versa. It's not so terrible that something terrible happens to the baby, or it gets really sick or really affects them really bad. So no, our DNA and our blood does not cross. The placenta protects us from that. After about 10 weeks of being pregnant, I stopped seeing the fertility doctor. So for the first 10 weeks, actually for the first 8 weeks, I saw the fertility doctor like every week for the first few weeks, and then every other week after that. Once I became about 6 weeks pregnant, that's when I went in for the heartbeat ultrasound, heard the heartbeat, and the fertility doctor finally released me like when I was around, I want to say 10 weeks pregnant. I'm not positive right now. I'm kind of having like a brain fart moment. But he did release me sometime between 10 and 12 weeks to my regular OBGYN. And once I was released from the fertility doctor, the pregnancy became like a normal pregnancy. And I say like a normal pregnancy because I did have to go in for some extra, ultrasound appointments since it's a high-risk pregnancy. Any IVF pregnancy is a high-risk pregnancy, especially when you're a surrogate mom. It's a little bit different when you are biologically connected to the child, but since I was not, they marked me high risk. But even if I was biologically connected to the child, they would still mark me as high risk because it was an IVF procedure. So outside of my extra ultrasound appointments, I did have my regular OB appointments where I would go in every 6 weeks at first, and then every 4 weeks, and then soon every 2 weeks, and then every 1 week as I got further and further along. The intended parent, he was not local. He lives in the UK. Well, he actually lives in like 3 different countries, but he's from the UK, and most of his time during the pregnancy was spent at home because he still has a full-time job, so he still had to work. So he was unable to come out and visit me often. He did come out and visit me, I would say like every 2 or 3 months. And so he would make it to like an appointment here or there. We did an ultrasound appointment at one of those cute little boutique ultrasound places where you get like a package and get like a video, a DVD, and do the 4D ultrasound and all that stuff. And he actually learned the sex of the baby like super soon. He learned the sex of the baby around 14 or 15 weeks. And so he was really excited. But when we got closer and closer to delivery, some of the appointments I wanted a little bit more privacy because the doctor would be checking my cervix and things like that and making sure that everything was going well. Now around the middle of the pregnancy, I would probably say around 20 weeks, actually more so around 16 weeks, depending on your agency or your contract. You've got to decide which hospital you're going to deliver at. You've got to decide which hospital, even though childbirth can happen at any moment. We can't predict when or where we're going to be, but you do need to have a plan in place at around 16 or 20, somewhere between 16 and 20 weeks. I can't really remember when it was, but I already had my hospital picked out, the hospital that, was closest to me. And so, I put that part in, our birth plan. So after you decide what hospital you're going to deliver at, then you want to schedule a labor and delivery tour. You want to make sure that your insurance works at that hospital, number one, and at the same time you want to make sure that the hospital knows you are a surrogate mother, because if the hospital doesn't know that you're a surrogate, they're going to automatically assume that you are the mother of the baby no matter what color the baby comes out. So you want to make sure that the hospital knows you're a surrogate. To be honest, the hospital should already know that you're a surrogate once the contracts and everything are signed. Like all that should be filed, before you even become pregnant. So I would say, you know, if you're going to decide on a hospital, decide very soon so you can get that paperwork in early and there's no confusion by the time you give birth. Then you want to schedule a labor and delivery tour. Even if you already know your hospital, even if you've already given birth at your hospital, you want to schedule a labor and delivery tour, because chances are your intended parent has never been to that hospital before. They don't know what it's like to be on a labor and delivery floor. They don't know the separation between labor and delivery and recovery, or mother baby, maternity, whatever your hospital calls it. If they've never had kids, they probably don't know what the process is with childbirth, or, you know, with recovery and things of that nature, medications and, you know, certain actions that are taken, as far as C-sections or positions that you want to be in and things like that. And so you really want to schedule that labor and delivery tour, even if you are well versed in childbirth, just to make the intended parents more comfortable, so they'll have an idea of what's going to take place once you go into labor. Because chances are, once you do go into labor or you're induced or whatever, they're going to be so wrapped up and tied up in the excitement of just getting ready to have a baby that they're probably not going to be thinking about all of the things that they should or shouldn't be doing while you're in labor. And what I mean by that is being in your face, trying to touch you or talk to you, or, you know, bringing things into the room, you know, eating in the room when you can only chew on ice chips, you know, things like that. And it's like, you just want to let them know how things go, because you've had a baby before and you don't want to upset them or make them feel uncomfortable while you're in pain. You kind of want to let them know how things are going to go, and at the same time you want the people in labor and delivery, or whoever it is that gives you the tour, to also have that second perspective, that outside perspective, you know, of a person that is going to be just like them, kind of like a spectator of sorts, if that makes sense. Somebody that's not, you know, the one giving birth, giving their perspective and, you know, telling them where they want to be or how they want to participate or act or whatever. And so you want to make sure you schedule that labor and delivery tour. You also want to make sure, I mentioned this before, that all of your legal documents are filed with the social work office of your hospital. Every hospital should have a social worker, if not one, maybe 5. Every hospital should have a social work division, and all of your legal documents need to be in that social work office. They need to have your birth plan, they need to have your surrogacy contract, they need to know exactly what to do once that baby is born. Because once that umbilical cord is cut, you are no longer responsible for that child. Once that umbilical cord is cut, that baby is born, the responsibility goes to the intended parents. They have now gone from being intended parents to parents like that. And so you want to make sure that all that paperwork is filed and the hospital knows what is supposed to happen after the baby is born, so you're not responsible for the baby's health care. The baby should be covered under the parent's insurance as soon as the baby is born. All decisions regarding circumcisions, regarding any testing that's done right after birth, any treatment that needs to be done, like if the baby has jaundice and they need to go under the lights and stuff like that, all that stuff that happens in the hospital, all of those decisions are made by the parents and not the surrogate mother. There are no birth certificates that are signed by the surrogate. There should only be the intended parents' names on the birth certificate, not yours. If they come in there and ask you to sign paperwork with regard to the baby, you say, no, I'm not allowed to do that. Look at my contract. So you just really need to make sure that all your legal documents are filed, and that your birth plan is filed, and that the social work office knows what is to take place once the baby is born. Stage 5, let's have a baby. Okay, so I'm just gonna reiterate a couple of things that I mentioned at the end of stage 4, a little bit about the birth plan, and get a little bit more in depth with that. Now, when the intended father and I developed the birth plan, we actually kind of developed two separate birth plans and then came together and compromised and agreed on some of the things that were on the birth plan. The first thing we talked about was pain medications during childbirth. I let him know that I was definitely getting an epidural because I had given birth twice before, well, 3 times before, with my daughter, with my son, and with the twins. And with my daughter, I had a completely natural birth, natural and vaginal delivery, 6 hours. I took the pain. She was out like that. It was wonderful. I was 18 years old. My body could take it then. When I was 22, you know, it was a little bit different when I had my son. You know, he was sunny side up. He wasn't facing down like he should have, so I had a lot more back labor. I needed the epidural. With the twins, that was a whole nother fiasco I'm not gonna get into right now, but I did need the epidural, and I figured, you know what, I'm probably gonna need the epidural, you know, this 4th time around, so let's just put it in the birth plan. I want the epidural. So the intended father was totally down because he was already so apologetic about the morning sickness I was feeling and all the other, you know, pains and things I was feeling throughout pregnancy, that he was like, I don't want you to suffer through childbirth. Do whatever you have to do, you know, as far as making yourself comfortable when you're giving birth to my son. And so, ooh, I was so happy about that. The next thing we talked about was, you know, certain positions that I wanted to be in. And I really didn't discuss this with the intended father much because really I didn't expect him to know how to help me into certain positions. So I did kind of go over that with the nurse when they brought our birth plan out when I was admitted. And so I let her know what positions I wanted to be in, and so she knew before I started, you know, to feel the pain from the Pitocin that I was getting. I let her know from jump. I'm like, look, these are the positions I'm going to want to be in, because once I'm in pain, I'm not going to be able to give you directions and how to help me get into positions. And if I have to do that, I'm gonna hurt your feelings. So I need you to know what positions I need to be in under certain circumstances, and they completely understood. So that was great to add that to the birth plan. Now, something I did talk to the intended father about was who I was going to allow to be in the room. And with the hospital that I was admitted to, I was allowed 4 people at a time in the labor and delivery room. And the way that they kept track of that was by these little purple bracelets. They look almost the same as remember those Lance Armstrong bracelets? I call them the Lance Armstrong bracelets because, you know, everybody knows what Lance Armstrong bracelets are, but those little rubbery plastic bracelets, but they were purple. And there were 4 of them, and I could hand them out to 4 people. And so I had 2 birth coaches. One was Brian's mom, and the other one was my friend Debbie. And then I had 1 bracelet for, you know, a separate visitor that I would want to come in, maybe a family member, my grandmother, or somebody like that. And then the 4th bracelet was for the intended father. And so, you know, I told him that, and that was in the birth plan. We had, you know, no plans for nobody else to be in the room, and I made that perfectly clear in the birth plan. So that's something that you might want to talk about as well with your intended parents, because they might want to bring in people that you don't know when your legs are like up like this and you're like, who are you, while your legs are up, and it's like you just don't want strangers in your room. So make sure you put that in your birth plan. Something else you want to talk about with your intended parents is whether or not you want the OB, the obstetrician, to deliver your baby, or if you'd like a midwife to deliver your baby. This should all be in the contract, but things can change over time, especially if, you know, if you go to the hospital, like the hospital I went to had a midwife on call and an OB on call. And so I had the choice of whether I wanted the midwife to deliver my baby or if I wanted the OB to deliver my baby. Now, because I've just always been the type to be, I don't like change. And so, you know, I wanted my OB, the OB that I had seen throughout my entire pregnancy, delivering my baby. But at the same time, you know, I couldn't be sure that my OB was gonna be on call the day that I went into labor. Thankfully, the baby wasn't coming, and, you know, I ended up delivering a week later than my due date, and my OB augmented my labor. He doesn't like to call it induced, but that's a whole nother video. He augmented my labor, and he did that for me while he was on call at the hospital, and I was so thankful for that. Going a little bit on a tangent, he ended up not delivering the baby because I was in labor a little bit longer than his shift. But the awesome thing was the OB that did deliver my baby is the same OB that delivered my son when I was with a different medical group 10 years ago. So she actually switched medical groups and, you know, came to my insurance carrier, Kaiser. They have their own hospitals. And so she works for Kaiser now. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. She just happened to be on call after my OB, who, you know, took care of me my entire pregnancy, went off duty. And so she was there and I was like, oh my God, it's been so long since I've seen you. You know, she's like, this is amazing. I'm gonna be able to deliver this baby for you. And, you know, she delivered my son. It was just awesome. Anyway, sorry, I went on a tangent. So you wanna make sure that you make that clear, whether or not you want a midwife or you want an OB. Also, if you want like a doula, I don't know how you say the word, doula, whatever. You want a doula, whatever that is, you want one of those in the room. Yeah, so you wanna make that perfectly clear in the birth plan. So another kind of, I guess, I mean, it's kind of hard to not decide, but what's gonna happen during childbirth, because we never know what's gonna happen, you know, especially with a high-risk pregnancy. But in the birth plan, you can mention that you would like to deliver either vaginally or via C-section. I wanted to deliver vaginally, and delivering vaginally would mean that I would have had a VBAC. And again, a VBAC is a vaginal birth after C-section. My daughter was delivered vaginally, my son was delivered by C-section because of an emergency that happened, you know, while I was pushing. And anyway, I don't want to go on another tangent, but I wanted to deliver vaginally. That was something huge. That was something super important to me. I did not want to have a C-section. I didn't. The recovery is terrible, and everybody's recovery is different. Some people would rather a C-section because they think it's easier. They don't have to go through all the pain and agony. They just get the epidural, and, you know, the baby is cut out of them, and, you know, they get sewn up, and, you know, they'll deal with the healing process. Me, I'd much rather feel the pain. Even if I couldn't get an epidural, I'd much rather feel all the pain just to be able to deliver vaginally. And I'll tell you why. The C-section recovery for me, I can't handle it. I cannot. I can't sneeze. I can't cough. I can't laugh. I can't lay a certain way in my bed. You know, I can't breastfeed. It's just, it's so painful for me. It doesn't matter what kind of, and it's like I can't take all these different pain medications, especially if I'm pumping or breastfeeding. And so having a C-section was just, it was off the table. There was no compromising there. I was not having a C-section, and I made sure to put that in the birth plan. But something that my OB kept telling me was, you know what, Dannaca, you're not going to be able to make that decision if, you know, there's an emergency, you know, if the baby's heart rate goes down. You never know if the same situation, you know, with my son was, you know, going to happen or not going to happen with this baby. And so, you know, I was really devastated when, you know, one of the OBs, you know, short tangent, I went into the hospital because I thought I was going into labor. Like, I was in labor. I was in labor for like 3 weeks, you guys. Oh my God. But that's a different, it's a different video. I was in labor for like 3 weeks, and it wasn't active labor. It was early labor, but the contractions were coming often. They were coming close, but I just was not dilating. Well, I was about, I think I was like 3 centimeters for like 2 weeks, but I was in labor. I was contracting all the time, every 5 minutes for like, I would say like 3 weeks straight. It was terrible. But anyway, one of the doctors was like, you know what? Fetal distress and all those other things, you know, you're already late, you know, you're past your due date, we should, you know, deliver the baby, C-section. I said no. They wanted to admit me, I said no. And I actually went against my contract, and I probably shouldn't be putting this on video, but I went against my contract, and I told them I was leaving the hospital because I was not going to allow them to deliver the baby via C-section. And they would not let me leave the hospital unless I signed an AMA form. And what an AMA form is, it's a form, well, AMA means against medical advice. I think that's what it stands for. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. That I was leaving against the doctor's medical advice. And so I had to sign the form that said, you know what? We told her that she needs to get a C-section. You know, we don't want the baby to die or, you know, suffer from fetal distress, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. But she wants to leave anyway. And in my contract, it specifically states I am not supposed to go against what the doctor advises, but I was so against having a C-section that I went against the doctor's advice because give me a minute. I went against the doctor's advice because that morning, well, I spent that whole night in the hospital. That morning, because they discharged me at 6 o'clock, I had a doctor's appointment. I had my 41 week, I think it was. Yes, my 41 week doctor's appointment. I was supposed to see my OB. And I said, you know what? Can you call my OB? This was before I said I was gonna leave. I said, can you call my OB and, you know, talk to him and get his advice as to what he wants to do? Because unless he says I need to have a C-section, I'm not having a C-section. So I said, well, we can't, you know, wait 2 hours for his office to open, you know, and have you lay in here for 2 hours when, you know, we need the bed and all this other stuff. And I said, well, you know what? I'm just gonna go to my appointment. My appointment is in 2 hours. Actually, it's actually in 2.5 hours. My appointment's at 8:30. At 6 o'clock, I'm leaving. And so I'll let him tell me what I need to do. Now, I said all that to say that you should never go against what your contract states. That's something that I did. That's a risk that I took. Don't do that. Do not do that. Always go with what your contract states. Never go against your contract. But anyway, you know, I went in, talked to the doctor. He said, no, you don't have to have a C-section yet, but if you don't give birth by, you know, such and such date, come into the hospital. I'll be at the hospital on this date and we will augment your labor. So because it was in my birth plan that I just really didn't want to have a C-section, my OB was, you know, super understanding, and he made the way for me to have a vaginal delivery, which I did. So thankful for. Something else that was in the birth plan, the last thing I'll mention that was in the birth plan, I'm not going to mention every single thing because this video has got to be an hour long by now. Something else that was mentioned in the birth plan was skin to skin. For those of you that don't know what skin to skin is, basically right after the baby is born, after you've pushed the baby out, or even after you've given birth to the baby via C-section, mothers love to do the skin to skin where, you know, she'll take off her shirt and they will lay the baby on her bare chest where it's very warm and where the heart beats, because that's what the baby recognizes from being in utero. You know, the baby recognizes the mother's heartbeat and the warmth of the mother's chest. And so it's like, it's a bonding thing. And so we talked about skin to skin. Now, did I want skin to skin? No, because the baby was not mine. And so instead of doing skin to skin with me, directly after birth, the baby was laid on the father's chest. So he took his shirt off after the baby was born, and he sat down on the little, you know, the couch thing or whatever, the day bed that pulls out that, you know, fathers usually sleep on overnight if, you know, while mom's in labor. So he sat down on that, he took his shirt off, and they brought the baby over to him and laid the baby on his bare chest, and they put a blanket over the baby, and he held the baby and he bonded. Oh my God, I'm getting emotional. And he, you know, he cried a little bit, and it was a beautiful, wonderful experience. And so skin to skin is definitely something that you want to put in the birth plan for the intended parents. It was an awesome experience for him, and definitely something you want to let the hospital know, you want to let the nurses know, you want to let the OB know that, or your midwife, that as soon as that baby comes out, that skin to skin is super important for bonding with the intended parents, whether it be the intended mom, the intended father, whatever. It's super, super important. Now I want to talk a little bit about the afterbirth plan. The afterbirth plan that we put together had a lot to do with breastfeeding, you know, whether or not I was going to breastfeed the baby, how we would wear the security tags. Would I get a security tag matched to the baby, or would just the intended parent get the security tag attached to the baby? How does that all work? Is the baby going to room in with me? Would the baby sleep in the nursery? Would the intended parents room in with me during my recovery? How we would work out the whole birth certificate thing, who signs the birth certificate, whose names are on the birth certificate. Circumcision, if you're giving birth to a baby boy, are we going to circumcise the baby in the hospital? Is that something that the intended parents want to do? In my case, my intended parent, he's Jewish, and so there is, I forget what it's called. I think it starts with an M. I forget what it's called. Gosh, it's on the tip of my tongue. Darn it. Well, anyway, I'll put it up here somewhere. They usually do the circumcision 8 days after the baby is born. Now, I'm totally against getting a baby circumcised after the first or second day. You know, after birth, because, you know, the nerve endings, you know, within the first 24 hours, they're not completely, you know, grown at the tip of the penis or anything yet. And so doing the circumcision, you know, within the first 24 to 48 hours is the best, is what, you know, doctors say, pediatricians say. And so I was really trying to push him to get the circumcision within the first couple of days, but because of his religious preference, he had like this celebration, you know, where he had a rabbi, I forget what you call them. They have a certain name that they have, the particular rabbis that perform the circumcision. He planned, you know, the whole event, you know, for the 8th day after birth, and it turned out fine, which is good. So that turned out great. But yeah, that if you do have Jewish intended parents, you definitely want to discuss that, because the nurse or the OB or the pediatrician that comes to visit the baby after birth is going to ask if you want to do the circumcision right then and there. Also, in my case, with regard to being discharged from the hospital, now with my kids, I didn't leave the hospital without my kids, without my babies, and my babies didn't leave the hospital without me. So if there was something wrong with the baby and I was fine, I told the doctor I was staying. So my insurance needed to pay for me to stay with my baby in the hospital. I wasn't leaving. And that actually happened with my son, because my son was jaundiced, and because I had a C-section, they said I could stay the extra days with Sean. Otherwise, I probably would have been discharged, but I would have been living at the hospital anyway. I never would have left my baby's side. I never would have left Sean's side, because I was super worried. And so with this case, since it was different, since it wasn't my baby, Samuel was delivered, and literally, like, I think it was like maybe 12 or 13 hours later, he was discharged, and I stayed for like 2 days. I think I stayed in the hospital for about 2 days, and then I was discharged. So yeah, Samuel left with his father like 13 hours after birth, and I was super excited. I mean, I visited with him or whatever, you know, before he left, but it was awesome. I didn't have any attachment issues or any of that, but I'll talk about the attachment issues later on. So with regard to the security bracelets, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. The security bracelets, they made me wear one of the security bracelets, I guess just to identify who gave birth to the baby. Not to really say that I was the baby's mother, but just to identify who gave birth to the baby. And the reason that is because if there were any complications during childbirth that I experienced, they wanted to make sure that the baby was okay as well. They needed a baby to match me up with regard to whatever complications I was having. All right, now I want to talk about the attachment that a couple of you have asked me about. Some of you have asked me, you know, how did you not feel attached? How did you get over the attachment issue? You know, didn't you feel like depressed afterward? Didn't you feel like you were giving a baby up? No, I definitely did not. And this is why I tell people I believe that I am like the perfect gestational surrogate. I had absolutely no attachments to the baby. Not from the moment I knew I was pregnant, I found out I was pregnant, up until the moment the baby left the restaurant when I said goodbye to him. I don't miss the baby at all. And I know that sounds pretty up, but I'm being completely honest with you. I had no maternal really attachment to the baby. I felt nothing. Whenever I held him, I felt like, oh, you have such a beautiful baby. It was kind of like, oh, you know, you gave birth to this wonderful baby. That's wonderful. The baby's beautiful. It's great. When I saw the baby, when I visited with the baby the 2 times after, it was like I had never given birth to him. I never felt a connection as though I was ever pregnant with him at all. When he was born, it was kind of like, it was like an out-of-body experience. Like, I felt like I was watching somebody else give birth. Like, my head was attached to their head, like my head was attached to their shoulder or something, and I was watching this other person give birth to this baby. And not just because the baby was white, but just because, I don't know, I mean, I remember pushing. I remember the way it felt while I was pushing. I remember seeing the baby come out of me. I remember, you know, them laying the baby on my stomach, obviously not bare. We didn't do the skin to skin. They had like a blanket or something under the baby, and as, you know, the dad, he cut the cord, I remember all of that, and I was there. My legs were to the sky. I remember all of that, but as I was watching, it, like I said, it was like an out-of-body experience. It was like I witnessed like the birth of somebody else's baby, but not as if I was giving birth. I don't know if I'm making any sense right now, but that's how it felt to me. And so as soon as the baby came out, you know, and even after I held the baby, because they, you know, they make you hold the baby as they're rolling you to recovery, because, you know, nobody can walk around with the baby through the hallways, you know, it's like a rule that all hospitals have, and you can push them through the cart thing, but the baby didn't have the cart yet. So anyways, I had to hold the baby while they were pushing me to recovery. And even as I was holding him, I kind of felt weird. Like, people throughout the halls were like, congratulations, and, you know, like looking at me like I was the mom of this pale white child, and congrats. But they saw the father walking behind me, so they just figured, oh, the baby's mixed, whatever. But, you know, I'm holding the baby, and I felt nothing. It felt weird for me to be holding somebody else's baby. Like, I felt like, why don't you put dad in a wheelchair and allow him to hold the baby and you push dad? But I guess that sounded weird too, because, or seemed weird because, you know, mom should be holding the baby, not dad, and you pushing, why would you be pushing dad in a wheelchair as if he just gave birth? I don't know. But that's just the way that my mind was processing the entire situation. So no, I had no attachments to Samuel whatsoever. None. No maternal connection, none of that. Now, you know, to speak a little bit more on that, I think that the father was afraid that I would, you know, have this attachment to the baby, and because of that, he wouldn't allow me to breastfeed Samuel. And I know some of you might think, well, that's weird. It's not your baby. You can't breastfeed somebody else's baby. Well, yes, I can. It's been done. Even back in the slavery days, if you can think back a couple hundred years ago, when black women would breastfeed white women's babies because they couldn't. When black women would take care of white women's babies, their master, they would take care of their master's babies. They would breastfeed their babies. This is something that has gone on for generations and generations and generations. Now, I'm not comparing myself to slaves. That was the first example that popped into my head as far as, you know, women being able to breastfeed another woman's baby. I mean, this happens today in villages around the world. When some women can't breastfeed, you know, there are lactating women, there are wet nurses that breastfeed other women's babies. And I was more than willing to do that. But I think that the father was a little bit afraid that I would, you know, I would bond a little bit too much with the baby. He wanted to be the first one to feed the baby. And I think his expectations for, you know, me producing breast milk in time for him to be able to feed the baby first were a little bit too much, because anybody that's given birth before and has breastfed before knows that it takes a couple of days for your milk to actually come in. And so, yeah, you can feed your baby the colostrum, and, you know, the baby can survive off of the colostrum for the first couple of days. But I can't pump a bunch of colostrum and you know, be able to, you can't feed your baby colostrum through the damn bottle within hours of giving birth. Now, hey, some women lactate prior to, you know, giving birth, and so some women are probably able to pump a little bit more a couple hours, you know, after birth than I am. But I'm telling you right now, you know, I've done this is the 4th time I've given birth, and I know when my milk comes in, I know when the colostrum is there, and I know that I need a baby to latch on to encourage my milk to flow faster. Now, if I had a baby to latch on, my milk would come in within 24 hours, less than a day. Probably in 12 hours my milk would come in. But I didn't have a baby to latch on, and he really did not want the baby to latch on to my breast. So I said, you know what? Okay, I'll pump, but it's gonna take me a while to be able to have enough milk reserve for you to be able to feed the baby. And so what they had to do was they had to feed the baby formula. And that was his first feeding. He had, I think, like 10 cc's of formula, which I don't agree with formula feeding babies. You guys can have your opinions all you want, but I am all about breastfeeding. I'm all about breast milk. I'm all about breast milk being like the cure-all for, you know, for everything. Breast milk is the best. And I know a lot of women can't breastfeed. A lot of women, you know, milk doesn't come in, or a lot of women, they can't latch on, or they just don't get, you know, they can't, you know, the pump situation just isn't working out for them. They can't do it. It's too painful. They've got the cracking, the bleeding nipples and things like that. I've been through that. People who just want to be moms, people that are moms that have attempted breastfeeding and, you know, they feel like they failed and they want to try again. I definitely want to encourage you to do so. Once you get past that first, I want to say, week or two of painful, cracking, bleeding nipples, the pain of the baby sucking on your nipple and it's hurting and it's like, I know that feeling. It's like you're already cracking and dry and bleeding and it's like you got the baby's head right there and you want to put it on you want to latch him on or you want to latch her on, and you know it's going to be like the worst pain since childbirth. And once you do it, you're cringing. Every muscle in your body is like, with every suckle, your muscles are, you know, tensed up and it's so painful. But I want to encourage you to keep going. Fight through that pain. You can do it, because after those first few weeks, it becomes like second nature. And it is the most wonderful bonding experience that you can have with your own baby. Now, since this wasn't my baby and I didn't feel that maternal connection, I could have breastfed him and not felt anything. Now, the baby might have felt something. Maybe the baby may have felt like, oh, this is my mom or something. If you guys want to believe that, I don't know. I can't really get into the mind of a newborn, but the dad really didn't want me to do that. And I totally understand that. I completely understood. But he also had to understand that it was going to take a couple of days for my milk to come in. And to be honest, it took like 3 days. Now, my breasts were out to here. They were like a 38I, I think, a 38I or something like that. That's usually how big my breasts get when my milk first comes in. I'm always engorged like massively for at least a week or two. It took a couple days for that to happen. But, you know, after a while, I was pumping every 2 or 3 hours, because that's what they tell you. You have to, like, even wake up like 3 times a night. You gotta wake up every 2 hours and pump. I stretched it to 3 hours. It was torture waking up in the middle of the night every single night, every 3 hours pumping. I felt like I was in a prison. I couldn't go anywhere because I didn't have a travel pump. And so, you know, if I wanted to go somewhere, I had to be back within 2 or 3 hours so I could pump. Oh, it was a terrible life for 5 weeks. I pumped for 5 weeks, but yeah, so, you know, we definitely, you know, did the breastfeeding thing where the baby was on my breast milk for the first 8 weeks of his life. They left when he was 8 weeks old. They went back to the UK. And so I was able to stop pumping around the 5th week because I had pumped enough reserve to last the baby throughout the 8 weeks of his stay here in the United States. And so, as a matter of fact, I pumped a total, I remember the number, let me think. I pumped a total of 1,116 ounces, and the baby was eating 15 to 18 ounces a day. So that lasted the baby a little over 8 weeks. I actually pumped a little more than 8 weeks worth of milk for the baby. And so, yeah, I pumped a lot, and I pumped it all in 5 weeks time. So, you know, we had the couriers come and pick up the milk, you know, every week or so. And the baby had plenty of milk throughout his stay here in the United States until they went back to the UK. So yeah, I pumped for about 5 weeks, every 3 hours, every day. 5 weeks I was pumping. Life was miserable. So, but yeah, but the baby did have breast milk for 8 weeks. So I'm proud of myself. Okay, so this is the last portion of the video. I want to answer the question that somebody asked, would I ever do this again? Yes and no. Yes, I would do this again, but no, not anytime soon. And by not anytime soon, I mean I need at least a year. Over this past 1.5 years that I've been going through the surrogacy process, because it took about 1.5 years from start to finish, I felt like I didn't own my body. And what I mean by that is, I take care of myself anyway, not just when I'm pregnant, but I felt like I was under like a microscope. I felt as if, you know, the normal things that I did to stay healthy and maintain my healthy lifestyle, I felt that those things were not good enough. And so I found myself trying really, really hard to make the pregnancy perfect, which it was. There were no complications with my pregnancy whatsoever, no scares, none of that, no contractions too early, like around week 23. The only thing I think I had like heightened blood sugar or something like that, you know, that whole gestational diabetes thing they test you for, and you know, if it comes back too high the first time, you got to take it this, you know, you got to do the 3-hour long test or whatever, and that came back normal. So that was really the only thing that was like a hiccup during the pregnancy, but everything was perfect. But even still, throughout the pregnancy, I felt that I was, you know, I was under like this microscope, like everybody was watching me and making sure that I was doing everything right, and it made me feel kind of uncomfortable. And so it was very stressful for me, and I wasn't really used to that. And so once I gave birth, and you know, once I was done pumping, I kind of felt like this freedom, like I had just gotten released from like prison or something. Like I was free to go wherever I wanted. I could go further than 100 miles away from the hospital or my apartment, and I could leave for more than 2 hours at a time. You know, I didn't just get that 1 hour out in the yard to exercise or whatever. But yeah, like after I was done, you know, pumping breast milk, I felt like liberated. I felt so free, and of course I was excited, you know, and so I felt so, it felt so rewarding to be able to give the gift of life to someone, to give a child to someone, you know, who otherwise wouldn't have been able to without the help of a surrogate. That was awesome. But the physical aspect of it, you know, the physical freedom that I felt was amazing. And so I want to continue to feel that physical freedom at least for another year. If the dad decides to ask me to be a surrogate for him again, I definitely will. But I would love for that to be, you know, at least a year from now, preferably during this. I'd love to get pregnant again in January like I did this time, because I was off from September 1st all the way up until next week, Tuesday, January 12th. And so I had all my holidays off, every one of them, even Halloween. I had Halloween off, I had Thanksgiving off, I had Christmas off, New Year's off. Now I usually have Thanksgiving, Christmas and New Year's off anyway, but there's a difference between having every single day surrounding those holidays off, you know, versus just having those holidays off and then the little week and a half we have, you know, during winter. So I had from September 1st all the way through next week off, and it has been amazing. And so if I do get pregnant again for, you know, the dad or another couple or another intended parent, I would definitely like to get pregnant in January. Please. I mean, I couldn't tell when I was gonna get pregnant. I mean, I had 2 cycles prior to the cycle that I did when I got pregnant with Samuel. So, you know, I could have very well given birth during the summertime if the first time had worked. You know, let me tell you a little bit about the dad, and, you know, why I said, you know, if he does come back and ask me to be a surrogate for him again. He was a single dad. That was a question that was asked on the previous surrogacy video. He was a single dad. He came by himself to the agency. He is not married. He does not have a partner at all, but he's older. He's 45. He was 44 when he came to the agency. He's getting older, and he figured that, you know, he traveled a lot. You know, he didn't have time for a relationship, but he really, really wanted children. And to the point where he wants like 4 kids. And I'm like, what? 4 kids and you're by yourself? I've got 2 and I'm by myself, and I am going nuts. And I'm a woman, and it's expected that I'm able, you know, I'm supposed to be able to be mama bear and take care of kids. You're a single father, you never had a baby, you know, before in your life, and you want kids? What? But then as time went on, I learned why he wanted to have 4 kids. Because he hired a nanny, and that was the person that you saw, well, part of her, you saw her arm passing the baby off to me while we were at the restaurant so I could feed him. And the nanny has been doing all the legwork. So the nanny's been waking up in the middle of the night to change and feed the baby, and the nanny's been the one changing all the diapers during the day and, you know, making sure. Now, what the nanny was telling me was that I think that, you know, at the time at the restaurant, she said from the time of birth up until, you know, 8 weeks, that I think she said dad only changed about 3 or 4 diapers. Now y'all know if you have babies, babies get changed between like 4 and 8 times a day, especially if they're being breastfed, because their poop is very watery, diarrhea-like, and they pee a lot. They're very hydrated with breast milk. That's another reason I'm all for breast milk. So babies get changed a lot throughout the day, and since he had only changed the baby maybe 3 or 4 times within 8 weeks, that's an average of less than 1 time a week he was changing that baby. And so now I know why he wants to have 4 kids, because he wants the nanny to do all the hard work, and then all the fun stuff he wants to do with the baby. Like they went to Disneyland, like he took the newborn to Disneyland. Went to Disneyland, they went to, you know, all these museums and went shopping like every day, and oh Lord, parenthood. But yes, he wants 4 kids, and so if, you know, if he does want me to be his surrogate again, I will definitely be his surrogate again. If he wants to try somebody else, I'm fine with that. That's okay. You know, there might be, I mean, the agency might call me because they have another set of intended parents. I don't know. They may not want to ask me because they already know that the dad that I just worked with, you know, wants to come back and work with me. So they may not be asking me because he might have me on reserve or something. I don't know. But yes, to answer your question, I would do it again. And yes, he is a single parent. He's a single dad. Now I know some of y'all are gonna have some opinions about that, but guess what? I don't care. So anyway, so at this time, I want to just kind of sum everything up. I want to let y'all know that this process for me was super fast. 1.5 years is pretty fast for this process, and that's even with the 3 cycles that I went through. The first 2 cycles did not take. The 3rd cycle did take. And after the first 2 cycles, I had to have like a procedure done because, you know, not all of my lining shedded, so I had to have like a DNC, because, you know, I had a lot of extra lining build up from all the medications and things like that. So there were all kinds of, you know, stalls going on. The cycles are usually a month long, depending on how your lining cooperates or performs. And so each of my cycles only took about 4 weeks. The 3rd cycle I started on December 22nd, and I had my transfer January 12th, and my due date was September 30th. I gave birth to Samuel on October 8th, augmentation of labor, because he was late. He was a week late, and I didn't want to have a C-section. I didn't want to have any complications, so I asked the doctor to augment my labor. And I gave birth to him VBAC, vaginal birth after C-section. It was wonderful. I had the epidural. It was great. Perfect delivery. Amazing. I'm gonna wrap this video up now, guys. This video is super long. Oh, I gained 40 pounds. During the cycles, I didn't gain any. I think I gained maybe 5 pounds throughout the pregnancy, but total I gained 40 pounds from the cycle, 5 from the pregnancy, 45 pounds. I am so far down, I think like 30 or something pounds. So I have like 15 or 20 more pounds to go. I'll work on a video to talk about that later on, but until then, thank you for joining me for this surrogacy process video. And if you have any more questions for me, go ahead and ask them down in the comments, and I will answer them as fast as I can. I hope it was informative for you. Thank you for your questions. If you want me to do a video on the egg donation or my weight loss journey or anything like that, let me know and I will, but I'm not gonna do it unless you guys ask me to, because I want to give you guys content that you want to see. I don't want to just do stuff and then you don't want to see it. So let me know. All right, thanks so much, you guys. Have a good night. Deuce.